Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 3-game Major League Baseball slate for you. This is a very small slate. I will be covering DraftKings and FanDuel today, so let's go ahead and get started. Though before I do, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really does help the channel a lot, so let's go ahead and get into it here. We're going to start with our pitchers, and we're going to start with Senga for the Mets. Now, this game does have some weather concerns, so do keep that in mind, but it also has a bump to bats based on weather, so while Senga looks really good today, he's probably my favorite pitcher on the slate. He is still somewhat risky. He's been up and down all season as well, but he's had 5 games over 18 fantasy points the last 7, and he's got a decent matchup here, so he definitely has some uh, positive upside. And there's a couple guys on Washington I do like a little bit okay today, but for the most part, he looks like a pretty solid pitcher today. Justin Steele for the Cubs. He's faced St. Louis 3 times this season. He scored 27, 28, and 11 fantasy points in those. He's also given 6 earned runs up in the 3 games that he faced St. Louis. He also had 20 strikeouts in those games. I will note that his last start was also versus St. Louis, so to keep that in mind, but he's got a pretty good average so far this season against them, so he has some utility here, though he does feel a little bit risky. Then we'll look at Dylan Case for Chicago White Sox. Now he's facing Cleveland, which is one of the easier teams to face from hitting perspective, because they don't get a lot of great hits. But he has 6 of the last 8 games over 20 fantasy points this season. He's only got 1 win in that stretch too. And aside from 2 games in that stretch where he's only had 1 or 2 earned runs in each game. He faces Cleveland twice earlier this season, though, and scored 15 and 10 fantasy points. So that's a little bit of a concern due to the K rate, but he definitely has some upside in this matchup. So I do think he's viable as he's been pitching pretty well recently. Then we'll look at Bibby for Cleveland. Now, Bibby has some nice upside in this matchup here, though he has a high ceiling. He is facing an easier team. His floor is forgettable, though, so he does feel pretty risky as he does have a really low floor, and he doesn't have the strikeout rate that some of the other guys tend to have. So, but he is in play against the White Sox as they're a somewhat weak team. Let's go ahead and get on our bats here. So we're going to start with William Wilson Contreras for St. Louis. Now, he has hit the ball really well lately with almost a 380 average over the last 10 games. He has really good metrics here. He is getting hits in most games, so that gives him some upside. And his price is fairly cheap, and that gives him some utility. Francisco Alvarez also in play, though he's more of a home run play, as he has not hit the ball quite as well as some of the other options, but he does have good potential here for a home run, and the metrics are off the charts, so I do like him a lot as a home run play. And then we'll look at Bo Naylor for Cleveland, who has hit the ball well as of late. He has home run potential here. He's hitting about 290 in the last 10 games, so he has been inconsistent. He does need a home run really to pay off, but he has been doing that a couple times recently, so he's high risk, high reward. Also has a tough matchup pitching wise. Then we'll look at first base, and we'll start with Goldschmidt, who I do think is a core play today for St. Louis. He has hit the ball at a 300 clip over the last 10 games. He has some nice upside here. He's also managed to score fantasy points in different ways, so he has some good potential. However, his total cost is extremely high today. Pete Alonso is also in play, and he finally seems like he's hitting the ball better this season. He had some really bad stretches, but the last few games he's been extremely good, and he's also getting some home runs again, so I like his upside here. He has had 3 games over 10 fantasy points over the last 5 games, so he does have some good potential in this matchup, and he has a favorable matchup as well. Then we'll look at Josh Naylor, who is risky today, as he does face Dylan Case, who I do like a little bit at pitcher, but he's hit the ball pretty solid recently. He's had 3 home runs the last 10 games. He's also managing to not strike out much. However, a few games he's been getting zeros, but his strikeouts are not a big concern, so it's just a matter of getting good hits and stuff like that. And then Dan Vogelbach for the Mets is in play. He's just a very cheap option that has home run potential. He's also hit the ball really well over the last 10 games, the ones he does play in. He doesn't start every game, though, so that's one of the things to keep note here. But if he does draw the start, he'll be in play. He's hitting the ball pretty well lately. Moving to second base, we're going to start with Nico Hoerner for the Cubs. He has hit the ball extremely well recently with a 366 batting average and averaging almost 15 fantasy points a game over the last 10. And he's doing that with stolen bases, home runs, doubles, triples, and everything. So I really like his upside. He's had 3 games over 20 fantasy points in the last 4 as well. So he's very interesting, just the fact that he's hitting the ball really well. Then we'll look at Morel for the Cubs. He also has hit the ball pretty solidly lately with a 297 average over the last 10. He's also averaging almost 10 fantasy points a game, and he's had some really good ones as well. He's also managed to get on base most games, though he does strike out a lot, so that is a concern here. And then Jimenez for Cleveland. If you go with the Cleveland stack, which is doable today, though it is a risky stack, he's a guy that does hit the ball decently well and has some potential for a good hitting day and has some stolen base potential as well. So he definitely has some upside, but he is high risk, high reward. But he's also a little bit cheaper. Maybe in the third base, we'll look at Jose Ramirez for Cleveland as well. Now, he has not hit the ball as well for some stretches, but he's had some big games as well. As you can see, he had 42 fantasy points yesterday. I don't expect another one like that, but hopefully he can get on track and start getting some 10 to 15 fantasy point games. So his price is fairly expensive today. Nolan Arenado for St. Louis rather is also in play. He's hit the ball pretty solid lately with a 300 average over the last 10 games. He's also got some home runs in that stretch. He has good home run potential in this game as well, and he does have a good fantasy point upside on the slate. And then we'll look at Brett Baty for the Mets. Now, he has been very inconsistent throughout the year, but he does draw home run metrics here, and so that's why I'm considering him. However, he is high risk, high reward, as he doesn't always have good games or get hits, so it's just a matter of a good situation, which he's in today. Then we'll look at Lindor for the Mets, who is a core play today. He's hit the ball pretty inconsistent throughout the season, but even without the batting average, he is still managing to get lots of different types of hits. Though he is striking out more than I'd like, he also has a stolen base potential if he can get on base. And as you can see, a couple games ago, he did have 2 stolen bases. And even before that, there was a game where he had 1 there against Boston. So he's got some good upside if he can get on base and do stuff, but not a huge home run threat. Then we'll look at Dansby Swanson, who's a little bit cheaper, considering the fact he's hit the ball fairly well recently with 3 home runs in the last 10 games. He doesn't have much. He is somewhat inconsistent though, so he has bad games here and there, but he definitely draws some good utility here, and he's a little bit cheaper than Lindor. And then C.J. Abrams for Washington, he is just absolutely scoring good amount of fantasy points lately. He's had stolen base potential every game. He's getting some decent amount of fantasy points most of the time. Even in tough matchups, he's been doing that. So I definitely think he's in play today, and he's definitely viable even if you were to go with Senga at pitcher, because he can get on base and get a stolen base or 2 and not hurt your pitching too much. So obviously he has scored a good amount of fantasy points lately. Then we'll look at outfield, and we'll look at Nemo for the Mets. He has been inconsistent throughout the season. His batting average has really dropped off lately, but he is getting some home runs, which is somewhat of a shock. He definitely draws good metrics for this game, especially from a hitting perspective, and he seems like maybe he's hitting the ball a little bit better recently, but he does need to continue to get a little bit better to be more consistent. Then we'll look at Luis Robert Jr., who is averaging over 10 fantasy points a game over the last 10 games. He's actually starting to get some stolen bases and some home runs, so he definitely has home run potential in this game, and he hasn't had one in a few games, but he has managed to score fantasy points in different ways, and he's getting lots of doubles and stuff, so I really like his upside in this matchup. Then we'll look at Jimenez for the White Sox. Now, he's a lot cheaper than Robert, and he's been hitting the ball nearly as well. The home runs are not coming quite as quickly as they are for Robert, but he definitely draws good metrics, and he's had a bunch of good games in a row, so I really like his potential here, and he's nicely priced. He was very borderline being a core play today as well. Steven Kwan for Cleveland is also in play, though he is high risk, high reward. He has hit the ball extremely well lately with a 349 average, and he's managed a couple home runs the last few games as well, which is a little bit surprising, but he definitely has good base potential, and he has a little bit of stolen base upside, but he doesn't do that a ton. He's just a guy that gets on base and scores fantasy points in that way. Benintendi for Chicago White Sox has also hit the ball really well lately with the 300 batting average. He's not a home run threat, but he does have a good fantasy point upside as he's hitting the ball pretty well, and he's getting on base most games. He also has a little bit of stolen base potential. The White Sox are definitely going more small ball lately. Then we'll look at Ian Happ for the Cubs. He has been somewhat inconsistent throughout the season. He really hasn't hit the home runs the way I kind of hoped he would this year to be more of a consistent fantasy output guy, but he has been good recently, despite starting the season really rough, and so I do think he's a great option on the slate, and he's also nice and cheap, which definitely helps. And then we'll look at Suzuki for the Cubs, who draws some really good metrics here. He's been somewhat inconsistent throughout the season as well, but he does draw good metrics here, and I do like his upside. He has good stolen base potential on this particular slate as well, as he's been doing that recently. He's had 3 steals in the last 4 games, and if they can continue to get him on base and do those type of things, then that would definitely help his fantasy point perspective. So that's what I have here for DraftKings. I'm going to show you FanDuel here now. So we're going to look at our pitchers real quick. Senga, he's had 8 games in the last 10. They're over 28 fantasy points. The matchup is not terrible, but he has good metrics here, and I do think he's a viable option. Dylan Case is also in play on FanDuel. Now, I think he's probably the second best option. He's had 8 games over 31 fantasy points the last 11 games. He has nice upside in this plus matchup as well. Then we'll look at Bibby, who has a similar Florida case, but he's not been nearly as consistent. And so he is a little bit of a concern today, but he is still in play. And then Justin Steele, who's hard to ignore with his 2 best games going against St. Louis, but he does feel very risky. He's a little bit more expensive than I'd like him to be. So, but all 4 of those guys are in play today, but I think Senga and Case are probably the 2 that you have to kind of choose between. Maybe in the catchers and first baseman, Paul Goldschmidt and Pete Alonso are both in similar situational plays with good home run potential and virtually the same price. To go a little cheaper, you can go with Josh Naylor, though he's a little bit higher risk today because of the matchup, but Dan Vogelbach is Dyson dirt cheap, and he's a guy you could use to go cheap on FanDuel if he does draw the start. Nico Hoerner and Chris Morel are both in play, though I like Hoerner a little bit better. Andre Jimenez is in play as well, but he's a little bit cheaper, but he's higher risk than either front 2. Morel does strike out a lot more than Hoerner does as well, so do keep that in mind. Maybe in third base, we'll look at Jose Ramirez and Nolan Arenado, both basically similar priced. I actually think Arenado is probably a little bit better, safer option today, just based on the pitching matchup, but both of these guys have some utility today. Brett Baty is also in play for the Mets as a kind of a value play. That's somewhat high risk, but he has hit the ball with some upside on this particular slate. Maybe a shortstop, as you can see, Lindor is available, and so is Hoerner, who's also available at second base. Hoerner actually has a lot of potential on the slate, and I really like his upside. He's also cheap enough that he's viable. Dansby Swanson is also in play at shortstop as a shortstop, so if you wanted to put Hoerner at second base, you could put Dansby here. But I also like C.J. Abrams, and he's kind of a one-off for Washington. While I do like the pitching, I don't like much of Washington because of the situation they have against Senga. I do think Abrams has some upside here, especially when you get some stolen bases. Then moving on to the outfielders, Brendan Nemo is actually a little bit underpriced today on FanDuel, so he does draw some good utility here. Luis Robert is very expensive, but he is got some good upside. I really like Eloy Jimenez's price here. He is close to a core play on FanDuel as he's just too cheap to ignore. Chris Morel can also play in the outfield, and he's definitely viable on the slate. Steven Kwan is in play, though he is somewhat risky today, but he is nice and cheap, so that does help. Suzuki is also just underpriced, and that gives him a lot of upside in this matchup. Same goes for Benintendi and Ian Happ. They're both a little bit underpriced, and if you pay down in the outfield, that'll help you pay up for some other positions. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.